Welcome back to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel, ladies and gentlemen. Today, it's a new subject for us all. We're going to the 19th century United States. I'm Josh. Some people call me Lando. This is my channel, and today we're talking about Holly's forthcoming book, The Family's Civil War, Northern African American, the Northern African American Soldier, and the Fight for Racial Justice, which is a title that slaps you right in the face and also leaves me with some questions. And those questions lead directly from the movie. There's like two movies about the Civil War that people know about. Okay. One is Gettysburg, just ridiculously long. And the other one, arguably the better cinematic experience, is Glory. For those of you who have watched Glory will remember the sterling performances from Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, and of course, Simba from The Lion King. What Simba did when he grew up. But yeah, and the questions I have derive mainly from the idea that in that movie, a great emphasis is placed on the fact that the soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry are former slaves. The majority of them talk about their experiences having escaped from the South. Famous scene in the movie where Denzel Washington is getting flogged. You see it has not been his first time, strapped up to a wheel. But if I can then turn the audience's attention to another movie called 12 Years a Slave, you will know that all African Americans in the United States were not slaves. And so my first question, when we're digging into the subject of your book, what's sort of the reality of the African American regiments raised in the North and this sort of dynamic? Because everybody thinks they're all slaves or something like that.
Yes. Wow, that's a doozy of a first question. A great question. So first, I'd just like to, for the audience, my book will be out next June with the University of Georgia Press, and I would love for people to read it. It's going to really push conversations about Black military service broadly, but also what does it mean for these soldiers, and more importantly, their families and the communities that they lived with, which I'm happy to talk more about. First and foremost, as you say, Glory is a cinematic masterpiece, right? There's no question about that. I love that movie. I would say that I didn't realize it at the time, right? But for me, growing up, every year, sixth grade forward, it was played in either a social studies or a history course. And on one layer, it was like, okay, here we go. But at the same time, it's like I realized it was, it's so compelling. The stories, the characters, the content, the everything, even the music, right? Like it just hits you as soon as I think it's Howard Shore's music hits you, you're in for a ride. And the choir that's singing in the background. But you also bring up, because of its popularity, some really important points. And I say this not maybe for people who are scholars or even history buffs, people generally who get exposed to historical topics through entertainment, and that being in this case, Glory. People think that Glory represents the Black military experience in the Civil War. First and foremost, as you point out, it is talking about a Northern regiment, one of the first. But that film, as many regiments know from experience, is that even for Northern regiments, a large proportion of those who will serve, sometimes through forced impressment, are going to be formerly enslaved men, right? So they will make up the majority. I think it's 70% of those who will serve in United States Colored Troop or USCT regiments were formerly enslaved. Glory hits on those points. You have, and I think it does a compelling job of breaking down the tensions. You have Andre Brower's character, who's Thomas, right? And he's representing the free man who was highly educated, well dressed, and he's coming at the experience from one lens. You have Denzel, who is very hardened to the experience. I believe his character was Trip. And then you have Morgan Freeman, who was also, I believe, enslaved. And it's like, so you have these, and there are so many other people, right? And it's like each one of them is layering what is the Black experience. I think each of them highlights what it was like while representing the fact that none of them were, right? Like Denzel's character brings up some great points when he's, spoiler alert for those who haven't seen it, when talking with Matthew Broderick at the end about, towards the end, like, what's the point? What do we get when this is over? That question stays with me, right? Because he's bringing up bigger questions, ones that many people, myself included, ask, like, what are they really getting? And also towards the end when they're talking, when Morgan Freeman's character is talking about he left his family in Bundy, right? And they go to serve, and I'm asking myself, well, what about those people left behind? Earlier in the film, there's questions about pay inequity. These Black soldiers are paying $3 less because of a military policy, federally government mandated, because of their skin color. So they're denigrated because they're Black, even though they're literally putting their lives on the line and doing the same work or sometimes more physical work than white soldiers of the same rank. When they say tear it up in terms of that bounty, which they see as a disrespect of their masculinity and also a cheapening of their patriotism, which are both true, the question becomes, what does it mean for those families left behind? So for me, it's always about recentering that phenomenal film, which I've seen 1,000 times and will always make me cry. But I'm always asking, if we step back and look at every one of those scenes from a familial lens, it becomes even more richer of a story. And it is, I love it, right? Like, but I also have, and other scholars like Hillary Green at the University of Alabama, we've been raising these questions about why is glory seen as the only Black experience of the Civil War that's in TV, right? I know, thankfully, Will Smith has a new movie coming out. I think it's called Emancipation. But like, it's been 20 plus years. Why isn't there miniseries? Like, there's so many phenomenal stories that could be and should be told. They've been written. We have streaming content galore, Apple TV, whatever, YouTube, like, all y'all. There's so many people out there that are doing great work that you could feed this streaming content, right? 12 Years a Slave, you bring up an excellent point in this connection. 12 Years a Slave highlights the precariousness of being a free Black person during the age of slavery in the United States. And particularly when you have things like the Fugitive Slave Act, and there are two of those policies that will essentially, through United States congressional policy, deny the citizenship rights of all Black people, deny the humanity, deny the freedom, and back and legitimize the protection of slaveholders' property, that being human capital. So there is direct connections between those films if you wanted to look deeper, and I agree with you. And if you really wanted to add another layer to it, a film like The Hateful Eight with Samuel L. Jackson's character is a former Black veteran. He's a veteran, I believe, connected to the Civil War, Buffalo Soldier. And there's that tension, totally spoiling the movie, between him and a Confederate veteran officer and a Confederate veteran enlisted man. And they're talking about race, public memory, like there's so much there. And it's like, totally going off on a tangent here, but like, there can be more done to talk about visual representations and public discourse of the United States Colored Troops story. For me, it's about what does it mean for free Black families? What does it mean for those communities in glory? So Josh was saying he's recently saw it, so he'll remember this scene when they do the dress parade, when they're going through the downtown streets and you see the children, you see Black women, you see white women, you see Frederick Douglass, you see all these people cheering and celebrating and pride. That's the moment for me that I cry the hardest in that film, because as Alessandra Larini and a number of other scholars have pointed out, like, that is actually a moment to talk about Black military service in a more inclusive way that goes beyond the men. Those children, those women, the community are there. Some of those men are armed to the teeth. So what does that say to have a Black man in uniform, whether they're free or freed, with military weaponry being saluted and praised in a patriotic sense, in a sense of their manhood, and a sense of everything. But it also presents an avenue for Black women
Mm.
to say that they've given, as they've always done, to this war effort, to this country. And what about their children who are there? Like, that's what I mean. Like, I would love to even just unpack that, the dress parade, the politics of race, of gender, of class. There's so much depth there. And I realize I
Yeah.
didn't even answer your initial question.
Well, I think you kind of have. I mean, you gave the answer and much more. I agree, and as well about that scene. It is a great scene, and you get chills watching it
Yeah.
because it does make that obvious point that, like, this is important. This scene, you can tell, you know,
Yep.
and uh, yeah, and I was also thinking about what you were saying, the 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 cavalry post-war. Black service continues after the war, and they go into the Indian Wars. There's actually a movie called Buffalo Soldiers itself. We're actually
Mhm.
giving people a watching list. If you want to watch these movies, they do exist. I haven't seen the
Yes.
Buffalo Soldiers, but I know it exists, and that's obviously a very interesting conversation as well for the
Well, I
Black.
mean, since you bring it up, just before I forget, and there's many scholars who have written on this, but it's something in my book I at least wanted to touch on because a handful of the soldiers that I studied from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, do become what we would call Buffalo soldiers. And they are direct, so which raises questions, one about Black military service, manhood, citizenship questions in connection with Buffalo Soldiers, because a number of these Black veterans are going to be directly connected to the eradication of Native American peoples and forcing them onto reservations, which to me was a real struggle with. These are two oppressed, historically marginalized groups being pitted against each other for the betterment of the nation.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
absolutely. And when you factor in the fact that the United States Army were using members of the Crow tribe as scouts and sort of playing on the divisions between Native American nations, that becomes an even more sort of pithy subject as well. But yeah, that's maybe an entirely different episode about post-war, what happens afterwards. But what I also liked was that you hit on something I had also thought when I watched Glory. Not to use this as a roadmap for the entire episode, but when
It's okay.
Morgan,
It's
yeah,
okay.
when they're I think it's the campfire scene, isn't it? And they're doing the
Yes.
song, the prayers, and and Morgan Freeman gets up and he says that he left his family in bondage. Now this ties in precisely to your subject, and one of the things that Glory doesn't quite address, although it visually addresses everybody attached to the army um, in that scene where they do the parade. Unlike other war movies, where you will usually nowadays certainly get some sort of home front,
Yes.
women left behind sort of thing, letters back home. It doesn't do that for a lot of these people. So let's get into the threads that connect the troops and battalions and marching camps heading on campaign back to the hometowns, and you're specifically, I believe, talking about not just freed but free. Let's get into that. What? Why these families?
Ooh. All right. So
How'd you
this was
find
part.
them? What's the?
Yeah. I mean, so the part of it was this was part of my dissertation, which was looking at. I really wanted to look at what does it mean for Black people who were never enslaved, right? Because for most people, and I struggle with this a lot, and I'm saying more public, not scholars or even people who read a lot of history, right? They people will talk about the Black experience in the United States as like it's slavery. That's what is a defining piece of the Black experience, and I don't agree with that. There are hundreds of thousands of Black people who were free, who had no connection personally, or maybe were the first generation born in freedom, and they have their own hardships, which demonstrate that racial discrimination was a key aspect of their lives. Because, as I argue with the book, you know, military service was not the first time that any United States colored troop soldier engaged like in war. Every Black person was born into a race war that nobody has to be a part of. So once we redefine the battle against racism, against gender discrimination, we can actually be more inclusive in giving agency to the women in their lives, to the children, to the elderly, to their ancestors, to like people 100+ years removed from them, and showing a way in which the Civil War is part of a larger war, right? Which many of these Black communities will take part in or avoid, because they'll ask the question that Denzel's character asked: what's the point? What do we get when this is over? So for me, this book is focusing on Black Philadelphia because of its rich history with emancipation or abolition, but also racial violence. Some of the biggest of who's whom in terms of people like Lucretia Mott, the Fortin family, Purvis's, Frederick Douglass is there. I mean, you name it. And I'm not even getting into Governor Andrew Curtin, the Philadelphia, Union League Club. Like there's so much rich history. Now, the Camp William Penn, which I'm going to write my second book on, was basically right outside of Philadelphia. You have so basically, I wanted to look at all of the soldiers who, from the 3rd, the 6th, or the 8th United States Colored Infantry, from this point forward, I'll say UCI, that were at least in the records, and by that, military records, that were born in Philadelphia and also served in either the 3rd, the 6th, or the 8th USCI, which comes out to nearly 200 people. And then I cross-reference that with the federal census, which is actually, even though it's a really dry record, it's phenomenal, because that's how I started to trace their familial dynamics, whom they lived with. Did they go to school as children? Did they work jobs as children? Did their mothers have wage earning jobs? Did they own real estate? What happens to them 70 years after the service has ended? That's in the census records, which they're a gold mine, which I'm happy to talk about that as well. And for me, it was, I use the joke of like Jerry Seinfeld, right? Like, I don't really care about these men in service as much as who are these people? Like, I really want to know. And that's because part of it is I'm the child of someone who served in the military. My mother served for 25 years. She's a veteran, but she's my mother. She's someone's daughter. She's part of a community. And so once I tried to take that lens of like, whom are these soldiers long before they served? What happened to them long after they served and died? And their family members are still fighting the fight to be remembered, and to force the federal government to remember their service 50 years later. So then we get a more personal, more intimate, a more, I don't want to say humanized, but it removes the labels of soldier and veteran. They're a person who did serve, maybe not honorably in terms of what the military states. Maybe it was, but it's like, what was their family structure? What were the letters home? Did they write? Was there communication between the home front? Were there concerns about pay, which does happen? I'll give you an example. So using the Civil War pension records, I thought when I pitched the idea for this long ago, it was going to be these Black soldiers talking about the 13th Amendment, the 14th, right? Like all the big policies that are drilled in my head since you're a kid. What I found was unemployment, disability, what we would now know as PTSD. Like, what was their community dynamics, marriages, education, like all these different things. And I remember it being like, I don't have a project. Like, they're not talking about, and my advisor was just like, fool, that's your project. Them, like their lives, like, and I was like, so then it forced me to look at them in a more nuanced way. For so long, and rightly so, We have been focused on the freed experience because one, scholarship has ignored their stories, and they should continue and must continue to be studied and discussed. But because of that hyper focus, we've lost sight of free people. People talk about glory as the Northern Black experience for soldiering. And I'm like you pointed out earlier, a large proportion of them actually weren't even from Massachusetts. Like just going off of that point alone, a number of them weren't free. They will become free, but they weren't born free. So let's focus on men who come from communities who were free, who faced racial discrimination every second of their lives. And doing so allows us to talk about their families. Because once we connect it to whom they're connected to, which allows me to study 1,000 people, it becomes more real to me anyway. When we talk about disability, unemployment, when they're talking about pay discrimination in military service, when they're begging for a pension, when they're begging for medical rights or like access to medical care, which transcends them, and some of these issues are still sadly relevant today. So that's one of the things I love and also get really sad about with my work is that yes, I'm talking about people in the 19th and early 20th century, but I've had the honor and privilege to present my work to people who are Korean conflict veterans, Vietnam veterans, in the UK, people connected to different periods of time in military service. And they often say to me, you get it. You understand the bigger point that I didn't do this in isolation. My family was and is concerned with me. I had people in my community writing letters and praying for me or, helping me in transition. And I'm like, that's the point. You never did this alone. And we all know this, right? But it's like scholarship could do a better job, particularly for those who are free. What does it mean for their families who get those tragic letters saying your relative has died? Because I'll just close with this point. My book opens up with a widow in 1884 giving her testimony to the Bureau of Pensions. And she flat out says something I could not believe in the record. Like, I actually had to stop and be like, I was not expecting that. I'm paraphrasing, she basically says something to the effect of, you, the United States Army and federal government, stole my husband. You ripped apart my family, and I have nothing. And it just sat there with that. Here's the thing, her husband, who will die in service, he tried to serve in the regiment that is connected to glory. He will actually get a staph infection along the way, not be able to enlist, and miss the birth of their only son. He will then enlist in the 6th United States Colored Infantry. He tells Mary Leeton, his common law wife, which is important because there's a whole problem of legitimacy, for at least in terms of federal government's eyes, that she must give up guardianship to his parents. She brings their newborn child to the military camp while he's training and makes him, Benjamin, publicly state that Jerome, their child, is theirs in front of all of the other soldiers. And because she does that, when Benjamin dies in service, Jerome gets a pension. So it's like, for me, she was fighting first with her spouse to keep that family together, but then also to protect their child on the potential death of her husband. And now she's fighting with the federal government to get that pension because they've stolen everything from her. That's the real war to me.
I mean, if that's not a movie that someone's going to win an Academy Award for, I have no idea.
I'm happy to split the earnings if this ever happens.
That right there, this story of this family, that should be inspired. That should be a movie that is inspiring people to learn more about this period of history. Like you were saying at the beginning.
Yeah, I think I've tried to write the project to be very accessible, right? So it's not a lot of jargon. I want this to be something you could hand to your neighbor and be like, this is interesting, right? I wanted it to be something that I could give to my mother, to these communities, because since I'm focusing on a specific subset of people in Philadelphia, my hope of hopes post-COVID is that I can present in their communities and actually interact with some of their family members. Like, that to me would be surreal. But yeah, I believe it's one of the most important things as a scholar is to make the work accessible. I don't want to talk about these people in such a jargoned way that people lose sight of the real story, them. It's not about me. It's about these families and putting them on a platform because they've been minimized. They've been forgotten, at least in public discourse, not in the record. And they studying them is a way to be like what others call like an activist, right? Like I put this in part of this fight for racial justice because they're through the pension process, they are fighting to be remembered. They're fighting for a pension, which is essentially a federally funded social welfare program and directly goes against the lost or false cause narrative. Because that's one of the bigger points of my book is people talk about the lost cause is like this, and it is sadly important because of the way in which it will legitimize white supremacy and minimize and successfully downplay Black military service. However, if you look at Civil War pension records, for example, they're not forgotten by the federal government. Even if they don't get a pension, they're documented. My book closes with a daughter writing to Eleanor Roosevelt while she is the first lady and says, I understand that the world is in a crisis right now, but I need you to remember my family. I need a pension. I'm not going to spoil it, but let's just say Eleanor responds, the first lady, in 7 days. I can't get emails answered in 2 or 3 weeks.
Absolutely.
And to me, it's like this woman is petitioning the first lady to be remembered for something that happened to her family decades ago. That is a powerful story.
Absolutely, and I mean, that opens up another rabbit hole as to the importance of the first lady in getting things done. But yeah, I was thinking, I was wondering as you were talking there about the letters, and so first of all, the question: were letters written? Have you seen them?
Yes. So here's the thing. So I'm using one of the key records is Civil War pension records, which are at the National Archives or on and some you can get through Fold 3 if you know whom to look for. There, as many others know, like the Civil War pension records are kind of a crapshoot in what they have. You don't know until you request and it's put in front of you, which is like half of the fun, I think, right? Because it's like, let's say you had a pension file. And you got 5 pieces of paper in there, right? Like that might not be a lot, but I could still glean a number of things. And then let's say I have a pension record that actually my wife is petitioned for because she's now the widow. There might be 800 pages in that one. So you never know. I'll say I found images of soldiers and veterans, excuse me, one who took like a photo that wasn't supposed to be in there. So I remember like flipping through the pension and I was just like, I said to the archivist, is this supposed to be here? And she was like, no, give me that. And she like, because no one knows sometimes, right? Like they catalog it, but they don't. So I remember I was like, wait, before you take it, can I please take a picture of this? Because I wasn't expecting that. So she did allow me to. But doing that, yeah, you'll find correspondences between soldiers and family members in the wartime context. That happens every now and then. The problem, at least from my interpretation of it, is you normally are getting the soldiers' communication to the home. But what I don't, at least what I haven't seen, is the letters that came to them. And that makes sense, right? If you're serving in the war, you're probably not going to keep that document or it's going to get lost or destroyed. So that's the part that sucks, is having to unpack what you think the conversation was going the other way. And usually you can get it because it might say, hey, Josh, thanks for that thing you said in your last letter. And then I can be like, okay, well, this was possibly, but I don't usually get both sides of it.
Yeah.
But still have enough to demonstrate that there is continued and concerted efforts to remain connected. Soldiers, in some cases, Leonard Kettle will beg his wife for a photo of her. Right. So even that, he's like, please send me something so I can remember you, please. And I think that's important. One of the soldiers, and I believe this is going to be in the book in an illustration, he will write on the back of his enlistment document, it's like on the ridges. So it's basically, dear wife, keep this document in case I die for a pension.
Mm.
So he clearly knew, or at least was coming to terms with his mortality. And it's this personal letter in which is part of the doc, his military service, which is in the pension. I mean, they're gold mines. I was not expecting to find a communication to the White House in this. That was probably the one that shook me the most. I remember looking at it and holding it, just shaking, and then seeing a letter from Eleanor's desk. Like, what is this? Like, because I was like, I had never, to be truthfully honest, I had never even considered any type of connection between Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, and USCT veterans. So they're phenomenal. I would encourage anyone. I mean, and that transcends time, right? Pension records are gold mines.
Yeah.
So whether we're talking Revolutionary War, we're talking now, you never know what's in there. And I think that's the beauty of doing this kind of work. I could hand you that same record I've looked at, and you might be interested in issues of disability, the tensions over trying to get the proving of one's disabilities. Because you see that a lot too, is there's a lot of assessments by medical examiners who will say things like, well, they're not really disabled. Or one of the ones I hate the most, you can't prove that disability happened during the war. So I'll give you an example. And this one to me, it blows my mind. A gentleman will get a piece of a shell fragment stuck in his head. During the war, they connected to Morris Island, which is actually, basically the end scene of Glory, connecting, for circling it back. The surgeons don't feel comfortable trying to remove it. So they'll just basically bandage it, but he will have mental issues for the rest of his life. Will come home, people will say things like he's touched, right? Like he's different. Like he was a body going in, he's not coming. He will die from drowning. Years later, his widow will apply for a pension. And in the records, they'll say, you can't prove that shell happened during the war. And it's like, I'm just like, what? Where is this happening in Georgia?
Yeah, where else are you going to get hit by a shell fragment? It's like, what?
And
Fireworks display? What?
Yeah, it's in the records where they're saying this happened on this date. So it's like the assessments of and this doesn't even take into account issues of PTSD or disabilities that aren't seen, people who have emotional, like all these things we now understand. Back then, they would just say, if we can't basically see it, we don't believe it. So even chronic diarrhea, rheumatism, lumbago, like there will be questions over the legitimacy of a disability. And that's the richness of these records, is they say so much.
It's fascinating, and that is pretty extraordinary example of the difficulties of trying to be remembered and trying just to get something out of your service. That makes me wonder about the experience of free men and freedmen and their families, and so it's what is it? Recruitment for the USCT happened in what, 1863? Was it began?
So it's technically 1862, like the unofficial. Like there's different military policies where they'll recruit, and this is basically happening in the South and Confederate territories. But officially, it'll start to take hold after the Emancipation Proclamation and a number of other policies. So the process and experiencing of enlistment greatly depends on the time, the location, and even what's happening in the war. I mean, just to be honest, at that period of time. So I'll just throw out some scholars who, for the audience who might be interested in the work on the transitioning from enslaved to freedom and the direct connections of their families throughout those processes. So I would encourage people to look and read the work of Chandra Manning. Uh, let's see, Thavalia Glimpf, uh, Amy Morrell Taylor. If you wanted to focus on veterans, Donald Schaefer and Tara Hunter, just to name a few, because they get into the difficulties, particularly the decisions that freed families had to make when the men or boys would enlist or be forced to enlist. And that's where things like Tara Hunter talks about called marrying under the flag, right? Because there's this concern on one part about protecting their families, right? And legitimizing in the eyes of the federal government, military, if those soldiers had died, and a number of them do, and that's or will get long-term disabilities. The free experience is really messy. Not to say the free days, and I say that because it gets more complicated. Again, if we're talking location, so there are people who have written about Black soldiers and communities in Iowa, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in Massachusetts, just to name a Michigan, and each has its own story. Connecticut as well. The thing that I'm trying to highlight is if you look at Black newspapers in 1861, 1862, even, there is outright resentment in the editorials of the Weekly Anglo-African and the Christian Recorder, where these editors and people submitting their works will say, what's the point? This nation has protected and legitimized like the property ownership rights and denigrated Black humanity. And we are being told this is a white man's, or as I say, a white person's war because white women are involved throughout the war. Everyone is in different ways. But what about us? What do we get if we serve, right? So that's important when United States colored troop regiments will actually start happening in terms of recruitment. A number of there'll be what I call bounty wars will break out throughout the North. Basically, each state, because of there'll be a quota for how many people enlist and will count towards that state's quota for service. They'll basically be paying to see how many more recruits they can get. Or they'll go into the South and count those as freed men as part of their state's quota, which is what you see with the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, for example. And Frederick Douglass and a number of Black newspaper, people will say, we're going to lose out on our quota because Massachusetts is taking and giving everyone money. Or they'll look at other places like when New York starts doing it and say, we got to do something. So there's actually, if we're even talking about another type of war, there's a war about where these men are from, where they enlist, why aren't they enlisting from their home state? And I mean, part of it's just, it makes sense. It's economic. I would go where I could get the most money. Mm-hmm. If the average laborer at the time was making $300 and Peter Vandermark, for example, gets $800 for just enlisting, that one-time cash injection is 3 times nearly what he might have made as a laborer. Mm. I mean, I'm just saying.
No, but there are just simple military economics. It happens across history. You go to the regiments that'll pay you the most. And I mean, I know in British history, in British military history, you had professional enlisters who would enlist for the bounty, desert, and go to another regiment. So yeah, so in the 19th century, they call that bounty jumping. Yeah, and there is a number of Black soldiers that do that, and there's also people who will steal their bounties, which raises even more concern. I mean, there's so many ways to unpack that aspect. I also try to raise the points of even when United States colored troop regiments are enlisting free Black men and boys, again, because sometimes it does happen where they're getting children, that a number of families will say, don't do it. Hmm. Or they will be looking back on that decision and say it was the worst one. So I'll give you an example. Benjamin Davis, again, he will enlist and his family will never recover. They will essentially dissolve. The mother, Mary, will never see Jerome again after she has to give up guardianship. Eugene Bell is a soldier from New York who was the sole wage earner full-time for his family. Obviously, everyone else in the house contributed in their own various ways, but his mother will say, years after, and he will die in service,
that she was basically destitute after her son died in service. So how is she reflecting on that? Even if people are saying he died glorious and, for this patriotic lens, she's living penny to penny. She's struggling. And now because she's desperate for a pension, the federal government is being invasive into her private life. Why isn't her husband or, providing for her? Because that's what a man should do, right? And so it raises all these questions for me about the consequences of service always connect back to families.
Mm.
And that's like, to me, this is a duh, because I'm saying from my personal experience, right? Like, but I think it's like, and most military families and communities know this, right? Like, regardless of the period of time, we all understand that point. So why aren't we making that point when we talk about the United States colored troops, particularly those who are free? Right? Like, we need to understand, and I want to be clear that my study on these Black Philadelphians is not representative of the Northern Black experience at all.
Yeah.
But what I want people to understand is how you can look at their lives in a more inclusive and richer way, to even when you're talking about the enlistment process, the training process, going to war. What is war actually? What is the reality of military service? What happens when they demobilize, or when they're not allowed to demobilize because of racist federal policies that say now Black soldiers have to go down to Texas, which is connected to Juneteenth, because of the suspected French invasion by Napoleon III, and also, as you point out earlier, to unfortunately subdue Native American tribes. So it's like, and it gets really messy. And also, that's not even including subduing ex-Confederates and a number of Black soldiers. Well, right, I don't want to be here. And that's where they'll get their disabilities, because in the places of the Southwest, they don't have access to clean water or food. So now they are literally fighting their commanding officers for access to food, and those have long-term effects on their bodies, minds, and finances. And what does that mean through all those periods for their families? What does it mean for those families when those men come home? What does it mean for those families when some of the men exhibit what we know as PTSD and manifesting itself, unfortunately, in terms of domestic violence in a physical sense? And I have some cases of that, and it's horrific. The stories are absolutely horrific. There's also questions about access or lack thereof of medical care.
Yeah.
Now, family members, and usually see it with the next generation. So it's most times their children or a wife who are going to become the informal nurses for these veterans, because they don't have regular access to a doctor or a nurse for different reasons, like financial. And they're not properly trained, but they're doing the best they can. And it's like, to me, it raises all these bigger questions about medical, pension benefits, like accessibility. It's complicated. And understanding how through all those processes that families should always be at the center,
Yeah.
right? I don't care if we're talking about Gettysburg and this moment, when that person died, or when that, this thing happened, it trickles always back home, always. Right? And doing that gives us a better, more deeper knowledge of the real consequences of war. And by also adding the families of whatever period of time we're talking about, by adding in the family and recognizing that the home front is also a battle line that is constantly being, in the case of what I study, redrawn to benefit their white aggressors. We understand that the men on the front lines are in one war, but their families are in another war that continues and continues.
Yeah, it'll continue for quite a while. And in terms of the shooting war, we'll say all conflicts aren't wrapped up simply in tactics and strategy and glory and flag waving and things like that. This is the point, I think. This is why works like this are very important, and why I think you're doing such a good thing by doing this. Because absolutely, war is more than battles.
Yes.
It's the battles of are often an unwanted actually part of war. If you can fight a war and win without a battle, that's excellent. Look what happens at the end of Glory. Uh, and by the way, Matthew Broderick, volunteering the regiment to lead that charge. Uh,
I struggle. I mean, since you bring it up, I think, there's, and this is something I unpack in the book too. And Glory, totally spoiling it, but sorry, y'all, it's been out for 20 years. You should have seen
yeah,
it.
yeah. Just go.
When he dies, as you know, right, like they bury those bodies of black soldiers and white officers together. And on one level, that was meant from the Confederate perspective
Yeah,
of disrespect. On the flip side, I would say, and others note, that this is through death, there is this racial inclusion, right? Which, and then also even going further with those who mourn back home the deaths, what they call, Drew Gilpin Faust calls the Republic of Suffering, right, in her book, and the Good Death. That's something I also wanted to bring up in the project, is that through, and as morbid as this is, through the mourning of a deceased family or community member, black, in this context of military service, these black communities and families are able to become part of this national mourning, right? And but they have to do it in different ways because maybe they're not included in, but it's still, we can talk about death in an inclusive way,
mm.
and which brings up a whole nother
Oh yeah,
nuanced way of thinking.
absolutely, yeah. Um, I'm certainly glad that in the movie, that the reality of the movie was the commanding officer said the 54th is leading the attack, not Shaw saying I'm going to get my men massacred here.
Right.
But
It's a powerful. I mean, there's so many parts of that movie that are just,
yeah,
and I mean, it is. I think, and the funny thing is, for those who've seen it, you can, when you read my book, you'll definitely,
mm,
if you were to read the book and watch the film, or vice versa, like one after the other, you'd start to see
mhm,
different layers. And I'll just say, so my wife and I, we watched it. She's, fortunately for her, read my drafts of the book and project many times. And when she watched Glory for the first time a few months ago, or maybe it was a year ago, I remember her asking questions throughout these different points of the film. What about the families?
mm,
Right? Like, and she kept asking, and I was like, "You get it
yeah,
now. You get it." But I
yeah,
mean, like, because that's what my mind was when I watch it. I'm like, "What about?" There's one scene in that film that shows black women at the military camps. Here's the thing, and even one of the soldiers who writes his reflections, unfortunately he'll die in service for the 54th, he talks constantly about black women were always there, that they were pivotal to supporting soldiers. I mean, this is like a very
yeah.
well known thing among
You,
of the time.
you headed off. You headed off the next question. I was going to ask, what is the in the camp followers? What's happening?
so, so that's the thing. So it's like, and again, the scholars I mentioned previously look at it through the freed women's experiences, and that continues on. And so, like Nora Lee Frankel as well, she talks about the widows and mothers of those USCT veterans petitioning after, right, for like what they experienced during the war. So the thing is, like, going off of the rhetoric and the language of many USCT soldiers, black newspapers, and even a number of white officers at the time, they weren't. They don't. And for the Northern women, they don't really. They're not using the term camp followers. They're calling them ladies. And those of
Yeah,
you who
yeah,
know
yeah.
a lot the racialized, gendered, and class, because there is a class component in the United States for understanding the term lady. As I, tell my students, that term was actually meant to privilege a select group of white women. So
Mm,
not every white woman was technically a lady, and which raises this whole other conversation about race, gender, and class, right? But the fact that in the North, in New York and Pennsylvania and other places, Iowa as well, and Massachusetts, black women are the ones who are funding the creation of the regimental flags.
yeah.
So to me, what does that say? That these women are engaging in political, national, gendered acts. So when people are saying, will you carry that flag? They're also theoretically carrying the support and nationalism of black women.
Mm, These
So black women
these
are,
yeah, these flags are twice blessed essentially. If you,
yes, right. And it's beautiful. And they have, uh, which something I wish that Glory had done, which they didn't, was actually show the flag presentations because black women and white women were there. but they weren't allowed to speak, right? Because, and that's a whole other layer of complexity to it. But Black women were there in terms of being nurses, because they'll see in northern camps that the United States Army and the War Department is failing to keep the soldiers healthy to go to war. They're sleeping on dirt. They don't have access to clean running water. And it's like, so they're sacrificing their lives. They're fighting germs. They're fighting, the elements before they actually get to the real fight of that being against them. So it's Black women who involve themselves in meaningful ways. Some just go there to support their family members and communities, right? So it's like, to me, it's not that they're followers, as that's their patriots, that these are ladies, that they are forcing publicly conversations about what is Black womanhood in the United States. So Judy Ginsburg has a phenomenal book, Army at Home, which talks about the fight that Black women have on public transportation to reach the camps to support the men. So they will file civil suits against, the Pennsylvania streetcar companies to get access, because they're saying, look, we're trying to support the war effort. You're more focused on racial discrimination and gender discrimination than the real war against our enemy in the Confederacy. And to me, that's Black women in general they are so important to any war, right? I've talked about this recently with my students in the American Revolution. I'm like, look, you have to understand, women are there is no home, like the war is everywhere, and it takes on different forms. And it's about how through these moments of national, international conflict, women will reshape public and national discourse about what does it mean to be a woman, a lady, a patriot, whatever term you want to use.
Yeah, I was thinking there about the idea of the Regimental Women, and the community that is formed around a regiment when it is formed. That is it's a small moving village. It's made up of guys with weapons and a lot of women and children as well. And it is interesting the language that universally is used by the regiments as opposed to what is like termed by the senior general staff and things like that.
Right.
The senior general staff might call them camp followers and extra people like that, but the regiments, they're part of the regiment. They're on the strength sometimes.
Let's bring up a point that I mentioned in the book. Is one of the officers at Camp William Penn will refer to the Black women as prostitutes or sex workers, right? And yet he's not taken into account in the pension records. These are the mothers, the wives, the daughters, because unlike in the South or places where the women are attaching themselves to the regiments as they move because their families are part of it, the difference in the North that they will attach themselves in neighboring parts of the city. So even though they're Philadelphians, they'll take up employment right around the outer layers or inside the camp as washerwomen, and selling different things. And they will say in the pension record 30 years later after the war, I wanted to be close to my son.
Yeah, you go where the work is. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, so someone like Louis Wagner saying that these women are, using these derogatory terms, at least the way he sees it, is it's dismissing that these Black women have emotional connections to these, like they miss, they love, they want to support, but they're also supporting the war effort.
Yeah.
And and the officer is not taken into account. What about using that language when talking about the white women? Because the white officers, women, like they're there, and there's not these negative assessments about their women. It's these Black women that are seen as negative in his eyes. And I think, again, that's a whole nother, like you point out, the battle for Black womanhood to be seen as legitimate, even as they're fighting the Confederacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's an even wider subject as to, how women in general are seen who hang around armies. Sure, there are prostitutes. It happens, but they're not all prostitutes. They're not all, just lowlifes following the army around. These people are connected to the fighting. And as we just said before, a war is a ruinous thing, right? No matter how good the cause, people's lives are going to be ruined by this event. And I think you have encapsulated excellently in the conversation that this is absolutely the case for Black women who, for many reasons. I mean, if you think how sort of difficult it is to see white women in the war effort, in the Civil War, then you can expand that to imagine. You hardly see, so after, like you're saying at the beginning, um, it's only really quite recently that proper scholarship has looked at the USCT. So then, so you extend that paradigm, whatever the word is, to Black women, and you have a lot of ground to make up. So
Yep. Now, you've actually hit on to me one of the biggest problems I have with scholarship right now. Uh, we know a lot about white women's important role in the war, and North and South, right? Um, but it's like we know about scholars have talked about Susie King Taylor, and if you haven't read her memoir, it's phenomenal because she was a woman who becomes freed. She learned how to use a gun. I mean, she talks a lot about the Black experience from a woman's perspective, and also in the post-war, because she talks about her husband, who's a veteran who can't find work. Right. And so like I assign her memoirs because there's so much to unpack there. But I think what's lost a lot of times, as you point out, and I've been hinting at this on social media, what about Black women who were free, who take it upon themselves to forcefully say we want to be included in the same way that white women are? They're being nurses, they're being washerwomen, they're supporting, they're doing the recruitment drives. They are actually so there will be a number of people, including a senator, William D. Kelly, a congressman, who will say the most important people to the war effort and recruitment are Black women. So, and soldiers will say the same thing. So to me, it's like, what there needs to be more. I have a new project I'm working on that's going to push that conversation, but there needs to be books that are centered on Black nurses, on Black washerwomen, on Black women connected to all of these important stories about the Civil War in the North, because they're there. They've always been there. They're in
yeah,
the records.
absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's, people watching today, if anybody if anybody feels the need to go and get into this, go get into it, because
I'd
it's
love to read.
yeah, I would too. The people think that everything practically that can be said about the Civil War has been said. I don't think it's the case. I mean, this involved hundreds of thousands of people. So there's a lot more out there to do and say. I was curious, maybe just as we wrap things up, do you know? Can you speak to anything to do with or if it had any bearing? I don't know. Mixed race people in these regiments.
Ooh, so that is, they don't come up in the ones that I've seen,
Hmm.
at least going off of the records. And that's where I have to always be careful, is because, as we know, records are flawed, memory is flawed. It's also being written through the lens of white men, usually. So sometimes there's that component. There are light-skinned Black people that there will be, and this comes up in some of the cases later, questions on if they were Black or white. Having said that, there is some scholars out there who've done some great work on that. I think for me, to the kind of closing, something that I've seen in the record, which I've toyed with, but if someone else wants to do the work, I would love it, and it needs to be done, is connecting the international experience to Black soldiers during the Civil War. So Richard M. Reed has a book on Afro-Canadians, and it's a very good book and pushes conversations to move us beyond the United States, North America, and that, limited focus that we do. But I've seen in the record soldiers who were born, according to the record, in Peru, Jamaica, Germany, Cuba. Excuse me. I mean, you name it. So all these different locations, and I'm sitting there like, say what? Or one of my soldiers, his mother, I believe, was born in England. So like again, like I have questions, and I did not tackle them for this project because like I don't want to. That's a lot of research.
Mm.
But I think to your point, that's just one example of things that could be done. I'd say one of the most groundbreaking parts of my study is that I'm studying these people as children, as young men. So that's something that James G. Mendez has done with his book, but I'm doing it, I'm trying to extend it even farther. Who are they as children? What was their living situations? Who were their fathers? Who were their uncles? And you know what I found out? In some cases, a number of the soldiers were actually related. I found that through the census because I looked and was like, wait a minute. I keep seeing these names and I see those same names in the pension. Oh my gosh. Right. And then it clicked because I was like, oh, and I was able to trace these brothers and cousins over 70 years because they kept staying together. And their relationship is really messy. There's a lot of philandering and tension, but it's like again, there's so much more about these people's lives that could be said. I would love to see more work on United States naval history and Blacks' experiences.
Oh
I
wow,
think,
that's a whole different thing, isn't it? Wow,
yeah.
but I love
And
the
I'm,
photographs of the
yeah,
Navy ships
and
because you can
so
see
there's
the integrated crews and.
Yeah, I say Stephen Ramrold has a book, and I know there's been some work, but there could always be more. I think even talking about focusing on the spy network
Mhm.
and the important role that people who weren't soldiers are doing would be very. I mean, there's so much out there, and
Yeah.
again, like the connection, I'm looking on Black military services connection to Buffalo soldiers would be important, and
Mm.
also as I wrote in my new piece for Muster. One of the soldiers that I studied was a freedman who will, after the Civil War, go to Hawaii when it's still an independent state,
Mm.
and then make his way to Australia as a sheep herder. I like, and to me, I tried to argue that each one of those steps was a political act, right? So it's like there's so much out there that
Yeah.
is not and can be told.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of people will enjoy this book. I hope the people who are just so interested in history, well,
Yes.
watching this video, will buy it. The book is Family Civil War. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, by Holly Pinheiro, and he's a great guest, guys. If you have a channel, get in touch with him, and he has lots to share with you. And it's been a delight to talk to you about this today as well. It's fascinating. I've learned a lot. Looking forward to the book coming out.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience. I mean, honestly, and I was saying this before we started recording, like, I'm very grateful that anyone wants to hear me ramble, one, but more importantly, like to hear the stories of these people. Like it's very personal for me to for so long I was, dismissed with this scholarship. People would say, this isn't Civil War history or this isn't,
Mm.
whatever. And to me, the fact that I have the opportunity to talk with you, to talk with others, and like it means the world to me because it's allowing people to be remembered and for their families to know that they've never been forgotten and they are history in a very meaningful way. I don't say history like forgotten. I mean, they are part of history. They're taught in classes. They're on a podcast. They're everywhere. And I think that's the beauty of, the age we live in and that people care about history still.
Yeah, I think so. They are history. That is the motto of the episode. They are history. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching this episode. But if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, leave a comment, question. We'll try and help you out with any questions you have, and you know, subscribe to the channel so that more people,
Yes.
so I can get more guests like Holly. You'll make Holly sad if you don't subscribe. Okay?
And you don't want
You don't
nobody
want
wants it.
nobody wants sad. So nobody wants sad Holly. Nobody wants sad guests. I mean, I'll be sad, but nobody cares. So
That's good.
so we'll see you again for another adventure in Historyland next time. Wave to the people.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.